Well, hello everybody. We're going to have a conversation about redefining mobility. And this session is part of a 5-part series run by BMW Herbert Quandt Foundation. And it's their program we're doing in collaboration with the CBF. It's called a RISE program, which is exploring the new leaderships we require for cities. And RISE resilient, intelligent, sustainable, and equitable. Now, I've got a really interesting set of speakers here. I've got Geza Zimmer, professor at the Hafen Universität Hamburg, research director of the new UN Technology Accelerators for Cities. So that's one person. The next person I've got is Eric, another professor of cultural philosophy. I love that. But he's also an activist and a co-founder of Cosmopolis and on the advisory committee of the Global Parliament of Mayors. And then we've got Annika Goss-Foster, who's director of Detroit Future City. And finally, Benji de la Peña, CEO of Shared Use Mobility Center, and he chairs the Global Parliament, not the Parliament, the partnership, I hope it was a parliament, of informal transportation. Now, because we're in this digital world, Giza's zooming in from Switzerland, Annika's zooming in from, zooming, Microsofting in from Greece. Benji got up very early, he's in Seattle, and the solid Eric is in Brussels. Anyway, look, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, but it's obviously a free-flowing conversation. You can interrupt me, you can talk about to each other and so on. And what we're going to discuss is obviously what the topic is, what it's about, where next. Now, each of you obviously has a specialism, but you've all got a 360-degree view on mobility, I think. But I want to start off with a question to all of you, because we're claiming mobility is a universal enabler of human development. Now, okay, but when you hear the word mobility, do you think of cars and transport, or do you think of something else? What comes to your mind? And do you mind if I ask you that in a row? So, Giza, my dear friend Giza, when you hear the word mobility, what the hell do you think that is?
Yeah, hello everyone. First of all, thanks for inviting me, and then I'm glad to meet also all the discussants here on the podium of cars. I mean, when you speak about mobility or when you speak about urban planning, mobility is always the first issue in Europe, in the global south, all over. But I actually see mobility, of course, in a far broader context. I see not only machines, vehicles, I see people moving in cities. And also in the countryside, this is neglected very often. And I think also of like migration, I think of refugee camps, I think of climate refugees, a large shift in terms of where people live, flooding, storms, rain. So this is there are a lot of issues. I mean, mobility is not only in a city, mobility is in the whole world. And when we speak about mobility, we often speak also about tourism, for example. So many, many different issues. But I think one thing is very special. When we speak about mobility, we very often speak about mobility as a very technical issue. And like we speak about sensors, we speak about infrastructure, we count numbers of cars. But I think mobility is also very male dominated. It's not a very diverse discourse. And I think we should understand it in a very much broader context, in a more social context, like speaking about other qualitative issues like safety in public space, care mobility, other informal routes in cities. Maybe we can go into details a little later, but we should see mobility in a much broader context and not only speak about cars.
What about you, Eric? You and cars, or is it more about something much bigger?
Well, yes, at first sight, we think about transport. But in my field, in fact, we speak about the space of flows and about the big transition, in fact, over the last half century, let's say, from a space of places, let's say dominated by places, to a space of flows. And as my field of research is urban studies, I want to underline that the New World system is in fact an urban system, and that the urban system is not, let's say, a world of countries that with their borders, border lines, and with their tragic differences, but in fact a networked places of nodes where the cities are the nodes. And so one of the things I think in our framing that we have to adapt to the actual world is that the world is becoming in fact a network, a city network, in fact, with a totally different kind of territoriality than the one we have developed since the 19th century.
Thank you very much. I'm loving the way you're stretching the boundaries of this. What about you, Annika? What do you think of when you hear this word, mobility?
Yeah, and thanks for that. And thanks for allowing me to be here today. I'm really excited. This is a really exciting group of people talking about mobility. And, coming from the Motor City, we most often think about cars, right? And the way cars impact our ability to be mobile. But when I think about mobility, I also really think about our ability to be able to move from one economic strata to another economic strata, and how that concept of mobility can either limit us or push us further. I also think about mobility, not just about cars, but about commute time. Whether you're in a car, whether you're using a bike, whether you're using public transportation. And in Detroit, our public transportation is not very efficient. And so commute time is ends up becoming a very serious expense, where mobility can really be almost a disability to your own ability to create wealth, to support your family, and to meet all of your needs in order to thrive. And so I think mobility ends up being a much, much more complicated word, um, than just how we get from one point to another.
Lovely, lovely. What about you, Benji? I know you've got some sort of traditional forms of mobility, but I know you're a much wider type of person.
Well, first of all, thank you again for inviting me to and being with this fabulous panel. I go back to, and Eric might know more about this, but why do we have cities in the first place, right? And there are various, theories of why cities emerge. But to me, it's basically because people want to connect. Either they want to sell something to someone, or they want to worship together, or they want to meet people and live close by. So it's getting from one place to another is essentially what mobility is, being mobile. But that also brings the idea of what is immobility and who is not allowed to move, right? Whether you are in a wheelchair and your streetscape doesn't have ramps, there are stairs, you can't get around. Whether you are black and brown person and wherever you walk to in parts of the city, you are suspected and then you are stopped just because you're jogging. Or whether you are a refugee and undocumented and you're not allowed to cross certain borders, or in cities where there are exclusive walled subdivisions or gated communities, and who's allowed to go where and who's not allowed to go where, right? So I really like the way Mimi Scheller, who one of the people who started mobility justice as a field of study, said mobility is our ability to get from one place to another, and that's both in time and economics. And so when we talk about mobility, the most basic thing for me is what's in the way of me getting from one place to another, what's in the way of me connecting to other people. And it's really, it's I think a great juxtaposition that we're doing this virtually because we have been rendered immobile by the pandemic and we can't meet in person. So a whole layer of things, but including what is legal vehicle, or what is an accepted vehicle. And I'll jump into informal transportation. There are places in cities in India that if you are in a cycle rickshaw, you're not allowed to cross a bridge because you're not recognized as a vehicle. And it's all of those layers for me what mobility is.
Yeah, thank God you've explained that to me. Now I'm beginning to understand it. Okay, my next question is, because it's obviously quite a rich concept in some sense, the way you've described it, has it got enough energy, the phrase or the concept or the word, to really be the sort of driver of change and, in a sense, movements towards justice that I suppose we're implying? I mean, any of you jump in. I mean, I don't want to necessarily go in the sequence, Geza, Eric, Annika, Benji, but I don't know. Off you go at Geza. Now I'm going in the
Yeah.
sequence. Yeah.
I would like to comment also a bit on what the panelists said, and then I also answer your question, hopefully indirectly, Charles, because I wanted to say that I agree to everything that everybody said here. I'm a data person, so I come from a data lab, so we are constantly collecting, searching, combining different data in regard of future city scenarios. And what I can really observe is that, especially in regard of mobility, we don't have qualitative data. There's a huge lack of, let's say, social, cultural data in regard of mobility. And this is something that we really have to change, because when we want to visualize, for example, all the things that you said, Eric, and also Benji and you, then we don't have data. We have so much data about logistics, about cars, about traffic flows, but it's all tech data. But data about cleaning people, how they move in the city, data about kids, how they move in the city, data about queer people, how they feel in dark spaces with a different body. We don't have any data about this. And this is really something that I would like to emphasize, or I also would like to motivate our researchers. If they want to do research on this, we have to collect those data and make it accessible to people. That was not an answer to your question, Charles. I'm sorry, but
I will jump on that.
Yeah,
I'm gonna jump on what Geza said. That because and Eric had mentioned flows, right? And I think this is a critical thing of what we see, and by what we see, what we decide, and who gets to decide what, right? So for 100 years or so, all we're measuring is, as you said, car and vehicle movement. We don't even measure people movement. We don't measure connections, and we don't. There's a researcher in Georgia Tech. Her name is Cleo Andres. She does a census of connections to ask people, if you needed help, where is the person you would run to? And in the US, surprisingly, a lot of people can only run to people who are not in their city. And that means a lot in terms of emergencies, right? How much connections you have. And that's because, one, we're not connected. Second, we've built our systems and our cities based on what we pay attention to. And what we pay attention to is the movement of vehicles. And all of this data that's coming in that looks like, oh, we know so much now. It's all science and it's all smarts. But forgetting to ask, what is the data actually representing? Is it people? Is it people in vehicles? Is it just things rather than what cities are made of, which is people and connections?
Yeah, I want to
over
jump
to
in.
you. Oh yeah, jump in, please do.
No, go ahead, Eric. I'll go after.
The only thing I wanted to add to that is that, I mean, the mobility structures are made by engineers, and they know where point A and point B is, and the rest is observation, measuring, let's say, time and vehicles and how many people get up and get down in what time, etc. But living in a city is not a question of engineering. It's a question of mental mapping. And in the research about mental maps, you see that people do not recognize the same points A and B. That the church tower is not necessarily an icon for everybody. That the recognition of the space and the way to go from point one to point B depends on a lot of qualitative, culturally determined aspects. And so I think one of the things that big data should be complemented with is these kinds of immaterial mental maps that in fact determine the way the people read their environment and how they see point A, B, and they also make the difference between mobility and residence, because mobility is always about changing places. But one of the big questions in cities, of course, is remaining in the same place and what happens there. So I think the mental aspect of the mapping and the organizing should be taking out of the hands of engineers, basically, and put in participatory democracy, in co-production, in imagining the environment together, much more than leaving it to the experts.
I also think that this is really important to consider as an economic factor for this. That if you really, we spent a lot of time at Detroit Future City actually customizing a data point just around commute time because of this factor of mobility and how that impacts low income families who are trying to get to jobs. It hinders whether or not they can actually increase their own income. And I know I feel like I'm repeating myself a little bit, but I can't tell you how much that makes a difference to a family when it takes you an hour to get to work. And if it takes you an hour to get to work on a bus, it's not just inconvenient, it actually keeps you from taking care of your children. It keeps you from finding any new job that might be available. It disconnects you from family and other social constructs, and the expense of that, of it taking an hour to get from your house to your job, will actually keep you from even moving into a place that you can afford, living in a place that you can afford, and anything else. So I actually think it's so important that we actually add the qualitative component to that quantitative commute time of mobility and how much it actually ends up harming communities in a really hard number way.
I'll add
No, I
to
like
that,
the
and
way you've
it's
all.
also, sorry, go.
Yeah, you fire away, Benji.
No, I was going to add to what Anika was saying. The other thing, I'm in transportation, right? Is we measure only one particular thing. So when she talks about commute times, for another, a century or so, we measure people who are going downtown to jobs, and mostly that was men, right? And so we built our transportation systems so that they will go downtown, and because we prioritize, as Eric was saying, A to B speed, right? So we would build these highways so people can get from where they lived all the way to downtown and cut through communities. In the meantime, we ignored the trips that were not about work, and mostly these are trips by women going to drop off their kids to school or going to the doctor or going to the market. And so if you live in a community where you may have a bus that goes downtown, but you can't get to the grocery store, then what are you stuck
Right.
with? Then you're stuck with not staying in place, not being able to move, and then going, I have to buy a car because that's the only way to be able to get around here. And in the US, it's about nearly a third for the poorest families. The cost of transportation is nearly a
That's
third
right.
of their income. So I'm sorry, Gesa, you was going to say something, and I
No,
interrupted.
that's good. Geza, you go.
Yeah, I also wanted to say that I think too that we have to combine this qualitative data with quantitative data. So working with the engineers together is probably something, collaborating with them. And I wanted to say again that for us it's sometimes so difficult because when you go into the social aspect, there's so much informality. I mean, we wanted to set up a project about care mobility, for example, in times of pandemic, post-pandemic, or pandemic times. So 75% of women take care of children, parents, relatives. They take care of sick people, but it's hard to get the data because it's informal work. They don't get money for it, and you don't have like statistics. They just do it without. I mean, it's not defined as work, not even defined as work in our culture. And also when we work for the United Nations, for example, we go into informal settlements in mega cities in the world. We also have this problem that there's a lot of people count data analog. They go into the informal settlements with paper and pen and write down things, how people move. Data is not geo-referenced, for example, and then we cannot work with this. So that it's really, really difficult. For us, it's really a challenge. It takes a lot of time and at the end also a lot of money to collect those data. You have activists, you have NGOs, You can work with them, but those data are very often very poor. And this is, I don't know, maybe you have ideas. I think this is really still a challenge for all of us.
But it's not
Yeah,
only a
yeah.
question of data in research. I think it's also a question of urban planning, because if we discuss commuting time, poor families, etc., what we see is that they mostly live in periphery, and it takes a longer time to go to centers. And so one of the things we have to rethink in urban planning is this kind of traditional concentric model of a central business center, of all the main, let's say, the main institutions and shopping center, etc., concentrated, and then living areas. That is to have a much more mixed view of the city. We are now working a lot with the notion of, like in Paris, in Brussels also, we have policies with the 10 minutes and the 15 minutes city. That is to decide on what we call a foundational economy, the basic needs of people, to offer that nearby living spaces in walking distance. And when we have a modal shift from the car towards much more walking, cycling, etc., let's say the proximity becomes a very important quality of good life in the city. And I think one of the things in the post-COVID, in the post-pandemic reflections, we come out of a period where you think that the whole world is one. And if we need a kiwi, we fly it in each morning with airplanes. Well, we have to shift it. Production in short change, recycling, all these, let's say, these transitions that are needed, localize things much more than before. And so the proximity of living conditions is going to become a very important element of the quality, which means sustainable neighborhood developments, foundational economy, providing the basic needs to everyone in walking distance, you can say. And so introducing a totally new quality in urban planning, which of course needs also more cooperation, more planning, and not just leave the urban development to the market and the private sector and the promoters of this world. So we need, in fact, a social project, neighborhood by neighborhood, and trying to, of course, the big provisions cannot be given in each neighborhood. That is clear. We will not have a cathedral in each neighborhood or a university in each neighborhood. But it will reduce the mobility needs for daily life and reproducing daily life. But that needs a big shift in most of the cities. It needs a big shift.
Can I switch then
I,
to Annika? Because I know that
I
Annika has been thinking about planning so much, and I'm just thinking about Detroit and having been there, how these ideas of more dense, condensed neighborhoods could actually work. I mean, are you seeing any of that in the US, or can you do it in Detroit?
Uh, yeah, and well, Detroit is not a dense city. It's a very large city with very low density. And I think I'm glad you called on me, because I would have added to Eric's point. One of the things that I think really hinders cities like Detroit, and or even other large cities in the United States. And what's happening, and I think in the United States, is that unlike, I think, European cities, most of people who are living low income, people of color, are concentrated in the city core. And then once you are of a certain means, you move out to the suburbs. But from an urban planning standpoint, as we plan for cities, as we even plan for new development and where we want people to live, we are still using some of that old middle class suburban um, modality of place that really focuses on this, two parent, 2.3 children in a house with a garage attached, and going for bedroom community concept, and that's not how people are living, and it's not even supportive to the kinds of families that we want to move out of poverty or move from into middle class and stabilized. And so to be when what I think we need to begin to normalize more, especially in urban centers, are how new immigrant families are moving or concentrating in cities where they are creating their own internal mobility, their own internal economies that are stabilizing and supporting neighborhoods in a whole different way, that are not really as reliant on this ideal of a suburban middle class lifestyle.
Yeah, just before I come to Giza, and I want to ask you about visualization in a minute, Giza, if you don't mind, because you've done fantastic work on that. Benji, can you just say a few comments looking at it from the US perspective about this question of whether you can have these more dense proximity type places?
I'm going to comment from both the US perspective and the Global South perspective, right? Because there's kind of, and I'm sorry to have to be the one to speak it, not that I don't respect, I'm an urban planner myself, right? But there's a narrative of why do we need that data? Who's going to make decisions? And urban planning, who are we planning for and who's going to make decisions? So this idea of the 15-minute city, if you go to any informal settlement and you walk into it, it depends on your frame. If you walk in and you see problems, you will think people have bad housing, there's septic problems and sewerage, and there's poverty. Or you can walk into any informal settlement in the world, and I will guarantee you, if you pay attention, you will see store, restaurant, inns, factories. This whole idea of separating, you live here and you work there, that's kind of a modernist 20th century idea, right, of how cities work. But self-generated cities, and I love that term, user-generated city, comes from Rahul Matayas and Matayas Echanove and Rahul Srivastava of Herbs in India, is they self-generate, and that's what informal settlements are. People build, and these are how cities emerge, and they build for proximity. So the house in an informal settlement is not just a residence, it's a production center. So you have a store or a little bit of factory, right? And what we've been doing since we came up with modernist planning is the city is a machine, we're gonna make it efficient. And you have to have this level and this standard, not to romanticize poverty or to say we don't need large infrastructure because we have huge cities, but very, very much we say we need that data so we can have the decision. I've worked with groups like Slum Dwellers International, and they do take these mapping and data. And they're very jealous about it because the reason they take the enumeration is what they call it, where they list down where everyone lives. They do their own mapping. They do this so that they can put up and concentrate their power and say, we are to be engaged. Because there's been too long of a history of, we'll get all your numbers and data and we're going to go off, and because we're experts, we're going to plan it. And in the US history, it was like, we took census, and you guys, there's mixed population here. So there are people of color. This is risky. We're not going to lend to you. That's redlining. And by the way, since no one's lending to you, you're going to get disinvested. So where's a good place to run a highway? Right in those communities. So I'm going to challenge that narrative of we need the data so we can make good decisions. I think we need to pay attention to what people are doing. Again, not to romanticize informal settlements or the problems of suburbs or inner cities, but we need to challenge that power dynamic and say, who are we deciding for? Who needs to know? What are we seeing?
Yeah, thanks. Geza, can you comment a bit on what people have just said now? And then, if you don't mind, on that visualization, because I've just seen some really interesting stuff you've done, because that somehow explains really these connections and all of this other stuff. Do you mind saying a few things?
I would like to comment on what Benny said before and then come to visualization. You're totally right. We did a conference 2 years ago, learning from informal settlements, because it's totally right what you said. Self-organized cities have already a lot of solutions that we are looking for in our official formal cities, without romanticizing it. It's right, but nevertheless, I think that very often the link between what we see there and the official government is very weak. And what we very often do is that we mediate between those data. Slum Dwellers is a very good example. They do great work. And the official government, because sometimes they tear down informal settlements without having the data or without taking care of the data, even if they are there. Huh? And our role is very often to mediate between the official, politicians, the government, and the informal settlements. I think this is very important. I just wanted to say that. Yeah, in regard of visualization, I mean, there is a lot, there is, of course, a lot of mobility visualization, a lot of agent-based modeling. You can see typologies of how people move in cities in certain situations, like how do you behave when you drive into a construction area? What do you do? It's a typical agent-based modeling visualization. And there's a lot of tech stuff like this, and also traffic flows and all those things. And I think since we now set up a lot of sensors in the cities, we have a lot of real-time data. This is quite new now, that we can really integrate this real-time data into our visualization. So for planners, for traffic planners, it's quite good. But what we are now trying to set up this urban twin technology, which is very important at the moment. A lot of cities build urban twins, and what they then it's a kind of like urban platform, and you also visualize it in a 3D system. Like you use also virtual reality, augmented reality. You dive into the city, you can perceive the city in a different manner. But also there, we still have a lot of tech data in regard of mobility. And what we are trying to do now is to bring the social data into those discourse of mobility, and try to show and visualize also like care mobility, or also having maybe a feminist perspective on this. And we will see if this works. I can tell you that there is no model. I haven't seen a digital urban twin that integrates this kind of data so far. And this is actually our entry point to this technology, to do it in another way. But you have to ask me in about half a year if we were able to do it. But of course, there is a lot of tech and a lot of methods and a lot of people who are trying to collect those data and bring it into images also.
Yeah, the reason I asked you that question is because so much of what we were saying was about connectivity and all of these other softer dimensions. And I was assuming, partly because I'd spoken to you in the past, that this is precisely what you were trying to do. So anyway, anyone else want to come in?
I'd just like to react to the digital twins, right? And the allure of that is that we can manage our systems better. It comes from factories, right? It comes from the idea of a digital twin of your factory, and you have complete panopticon control of what's happening, and you know where something breaks down, and you can direct resources to it. Factories, despite how big your production are unbelievably simple compared to the complexity of cities, right? And so this choice of what we pay attention to and what is data and what matters, that's all editorial, and that's all about power. This is an old example, but 10 years ago, someone was collecting the 311 data in New York City, and there was over 1 million entries of a year, right, of what complaints were and where they were from. And because it was such a big data set, they made visualization of it, right, to show when it would ebb and when it would flow. If based on that data alone, you would think that the problems of garbage collection were all in Manhattan and large parts of the Bronx and large parts of Queens, which are the poorer areas of New York City, had no garbage collection problems because you had the data told you that. But if you scratched underneath it, you would realize that what's up in Bronx and what's up in Queens, immigrant-rich communities, people of color who weren't taking to calling the phone to complain about garbage. Who are the people complaining about garbage collection? Rich Manhattanites. So there's always that danger. There's an attempt, and I'm not poo-pooing technology, we need it. But we need to be very, very conscious of the power structure, what we see, and who we decide what we call as legit. And someone had mentioned the problem of informality, right? Because you come into informal settlements and you say, it's bad housing. So what's the solution? We'll buy them new housing. Where will we buy new housing? Where it's cheap, which is in the periphery. And so we give them housing there. There is no market. They can't set up a store. No one's going to buy. And so all of those fail precisely because we only look at one part of it. And this goes back to mobility, right? Of what do we decide around? What do we see? What do we pay attention to?
Yeah, no, the reason I brought in on the information thing is because she, to some extent, she's a bit techie, not completely, is trying to solve some of those precise questions. It was my understanding. You wanted to come in again before we go to Annika Geza.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I absolutely know what you mean. We have to be very aware of power relations, but I'm still very positive because I think it depends very much on how you organize the processes. If you, I mean, we do work a lot with participatory tools. So if we get people in who want to have a say, who want to have a stake, then of course we also get their information. This is, I wanted to say, and when I speak about a twin, I don't speak so much about observation and surveillance. I think basis of a digital twin is first of all an urban data platform. Every city must have an open urban data platform, and this is a lot of work and a lot of money and a lot of basic goes into it. And in Hamburg, for example, we have such this wonderful transparency law, and we have a great urban data platform which is accessible for everyone. So I just wanted to say that I still think, even if I'm also very critical, that it's possible to work a bit against these power structures. We have to do it. Otherwise, I mean, tech is there, data is there, all tools are there. We have to go into it and try to change this and bring all those other data in that we find important for social equity.
Annika, I can see your smiling face.
Thank you. I did want to just jump in because I wanted to also provide a bit of a visual of what's happening in Detroit based on what Benji and this whole conversation is saying. So the census just came out with sort of limited results this year because of the pandemic. And Detroit is now losing more African Americans than it's lost in 50 years. So that population, which is still the vast majority, Detroit is 77% African American, and it was 80% African American at the last census. And so but what that 3% really means is these are African Americans with means. 54% of African Americans that are also middle class live outside of the Detroit boundaries. And of the stable neighborhoods in Detroit, meaning the census tracts that have 50% or more of people living middle class or higher in Detroit, only the majority of those neighborhoods, the ones that are growing, are all white upper middle class households. So and these are the areas that are also seeing more investment than any other place in Detroit right now. So when we think about mobility, I just wanted to offer that as a sort of a real life example of what mobility means. Mobility also really boils down to choice for a lot of people, where you can and so now in a place like Detroit that already really struggles in thinking about where their economic engines are, where's the tax base, how do you stabilize and grow a city that's inclusive? And so when we talk about that, we also have to think about what are our options for the people who are living there that can grow and raise a family and don't feel like they have to leave just because they have the option to leave. And quite frankly, if you look at cities all across the United States, I think you'll see a similar trend. It may not be as concentrated as Detroit because Detroit is the largest city with African American population. But I think you could look at a very similar example in many other places.
Thanks a lot.
If I may,
Can I,
on that point, on that point, I think, Annika, we know it's related to property structures. If you give housing to the dominance of the market, you will have these kind of mobilities, because you have gentrification processes, you have prices going up, you have now in post-COVID middle class people with an urban exodus mentality. If we live in the countryside, we are better secured than in cities, etc., etc. Because we know that. I mean, if you take an example like a city like Vienna, for instance, where the property structure is totally different, where the city owns more than half of the real estate in the city, and where they have a policy of social housing, the mobility structure is not. So it's not only a question of choice. It's not only a question of middle class people, let's say, wanting to live in other places. I mean, it's mainly a question of the structure of affordability of the housing and infrastructure structure of the city. And so it is possible to do otherwise. But if we want to do otherwise, the city as such, or the collectivity as such, needs a part of the property. Otherwise, a lot of measures and policies will not go to their end, I think.
What I thought was interesting, what you just said there, is about mobility and immobility. Immobility, i.e., the ability to stay where you are. So that's another dimension of this mini conversation here. I mean, does anyone want to take the topic into a completely different direction that none of us have predicted? Please do, if you wish.
We haven't we haven't talked about transportation.
What?
We haven't talked about transportation, actually.
Okay. Let's talk about transportation. We've got another 13 minutes, but only 4 minutes on transportation. Okay, off you go, Benji.
I was gonna just raise the banner of informal transportation, and this goes into the narrative of what we see and what is prioritized by who is in power. If you go to any of the cities in the global south, you will see four-wheelers and three-wheelers. They're called tuk-tuks or auto rickshaws and motorcycle taxis, and that's how the vast majority of people get around. And yet, when we talk about the multilateral banks or the governments talking about transportation investments, they talk about building the light rail or building even a BRT. Again, not saying we don't need those, but that's where all the investment money goes. And then the modes that people actually use to get around, they don't invest in them, and they see them as, artifacts of non-modernity that will go away once we have that big transportation investment. And they never do, but it's because people actually use them. The Competitiveness Commission of South Africa earlier this year had a report on transportation investments in that country and modes. And it showed that in terms of how much money the government had put in for, I think, 2 decades in transportation, only 1% went to minibus taxis. About 60-70% went to rail in terms of government investments. If they looked at the mode, and it was a complete flip. Only 3% of the population were using rail. 67% were using minibus taxis, right? But in terms of what was measured and what was important and what was decided, then it was rail people were investing in, because it's our urban imaginary of what a good city is. And we don't recognize that these little creatures which transport people, which help people connect from one end to the other to do their business, to take stuff, to get to school, to get to the people they care for, is as valid transportation. So again, that narrative of what is mobility and what is not.
We have got that logged into our minds. I mean, what really strikes me, which is why I do think the data question and the analysis and the interpretation of it is so incredibly important. I'm just thinking, for example, of Annika saying it takes an hour, 15 minutes to get from X into work. If you just, again, this is a sort of data analysis and turning it into money. What is the cost of those million hours a day to either the economy or the individual themselves? And that's why I do think this enriched gathering of information of various sorts, then putting it through different lenses. Because what I thought was so beautiful at the beginning, what you basically said, it's about connections, it's about the social thing, it's about the economic prospects and so on. To some extent, I really feel it was wonderful to turn that into money, because then you can see these sharp, perhaps often bad decisions. So even though I'm not a data person, I think we need a lot more information of various sorts of much higher quality. Does anyone wish to disagree? No, of course you all agree, I'm hoping.
Very quick take, right? The how much does it cost economically has been the argument for building bigger highways, because you were only looking at a one particular aspect of the commute. Google every city costs X billions in traffic, and you will see that number, and it will be use it to justify. Well, that's why we need to build a new highway, right? So it's also about what is the question you're asking.
Can I just ask then Geza a question? Oh, sorry, you go, Annika.
Well,
You go first, Annika.
I was just going to say the cost of commute, whether no matter how you're getting there, it should be it should be a formula that we begin to use as the basis for business and determining where business lands, determining urban planning, and we don't use that formula. First of all, most cities don't even know what that formula would require. But as you said, Charles, that's actually how you can actually get to building better and stronger economies, because you'll have a more stable employment pool, right? If your cost to commute is actually lower in general, whether it's a drive or whether it's some other form of transportation.
Has Geza, just before you answer, have you ever been asked to sort of turn your data into sort of money in the sense that we were just talking about?
Yeah, can I first say something else and then answer your question?
Say whatever you like.
I never answer your question, but I think I have a question to all of us, because we are here quite united. Huh? I think we agree, and we come from different angles, but it's more or less a very not only technical approach to mobility, but when I see the real mobility world, and I've been to so many conferences, there is this big ITS conference, you all know it. It's in Hamburg now, Intelligent Transport System Congress. And I'm part of the advisory board. And I was trying very hard 4 years to get all those issues in that we are talking about. This conference will open in a few weeks in Hamburg, and it's only about tech. And there are very few tiny things like, we have to plan it in a participatory way. We have to engage citizens, but that's it. They don't speak about marginalized people. They don't speak about informal data. They don't speak about nothing. It's a 100% tech conference. And I've been in Copenhagen 2 years ago. And Copenhagen is a very advanced city in regard of mobility. But also in Copenhagen, it was a conference. There were only men. I have never seen that in my life. I was like, am I in a zoo here? What is this? What kind of event is this here? And I would like to know, how can we connect our discourse to the discourse which is money driven, but there is a gap. This is huge between us and the mobility discourse which is going on in the world. How can we do this?
Well, can I try and profit? I mean, one of the reasons we're having this session is precisely to shift the narrative about mobility to this broader frame. And perhaps we can collectively write the sort of, not manifesto, but something that's so short and sharp and transformative, in a sense, to make a demand precisely on all of these events that are about traditional forms of mobility, which are far too narrow. But sorry, I shouldn't be speaking.
I would just say that, and I know Eric wanted to jump in, but Gesa, I completely agree. And I was at I don't know if it was the same conference or a different one pre-COVID in San Diego, and had the same reaction. It was a conference on mobility. I really believe, just quickly, that part of the problem is that we tend to socialize these issues as opposed to economize these issues. And when we just socialize them, when we put them in this box of this is for the social good, then it becomes much less valuable, right? And we don't prioritize it. We'll say, oh, that's good for the community. But when we actually say, no, 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 this is a business case. You won't have good employees as cities. Your cities are considered weaker and not competitive for new business to come in, and not competitive economically unless you make these kinds of investments. And here is the data to demonstrate that. We will continue to make this a social work project as opposed to a business case for it.
Yeah.
Right, Eric, off you go.
No, just on this point, I mean, I do not belong to the powerful. So how I can change academia, I have some ideas, but I don't have the power to do that. And those who have the power do not want to change it, because of course discussing all these questions doesn't generate that amount of money for them. I mean, you can have an economic macro model, but all these conferences are led by microeconomics, by sectorial interests, by sectorial groups. And so, I mean, there is an explanation for that, but I'm sorry, I don't think, I mean, maybe too old already trying to change these things. What is going to change a part of this is that their responsibility in the climate change aspect. I mean, mobility and the type of, let's say, big mobility, airplanes without taxing the fuel and things like that is part of the origin of our problem. And so they will have to reconsider their business model themselves, because it is not sustainable anymore. And I think it is in this let's say, these small openings, maybe that there is some shift. But what I wanted to say also, Charles, because there's not much time left, is there is an aspect we didn't discuss, of course, in mobility, is migration. In Europe, the migration agenda is absolutely dominant, and it's dominated by extreme right ideologies and nationalism, which means that the problem, it's made a problem. People crossing borders from one country to another become a problem. And there again, I am really pleading for another framing of that. From an urban point of view, we are not, that's a national framing of the problem. Besides, you have to say that most of the mobility is intra-national, and from rural neighborhoods or from rural areas to urban areas. So the big migration question of the rich countries is absolutely overestimated. But the point I want to stress here in our debate is that we have to look to a city without migration, without income, without newcomers, in fact, is going to die. So a city needs new people to come in, needs that. And so from a city point of view, the question is not migration, the question is arrival. And how do we organize arrival infrastructures that can integrate people in the space, in the economy, in the communities? And it's a totally different kind of framing. A city is not a country. I really think we are really dominated by a national frame. And of course, cultural difference is a problem for the nation, because the nation wants to remain what it is, his history, his tradition. A city looks to the future and has to change always, mental mobility is an urban feature. And I think newcomers help that mental mobility of cities. And I think mayors and local politicians should focus much more on that question of imagining the city in a different way than just a place in a country.
Yeah, now we've got a few seconds left. And what I've loved about the conversation so far is, yes, I agree with the economic argument and the social argument. And I think the thing that really comes powerful, becomes powerful is when one integrates those all together. And I think that's going to be my new project, frankly. So everybody, Eric, you've done your bit. Thank you. We love you. Everybody, 10 seconds, final words. Benji, the passionate
Oh man,
Benji.
10 seconds.
Yeah, 10
Well, since
seconds.
this is the Creative Bureaucracy Festival, I have one piece of advice that is all about this integration. Whenever you are looking at a problem, always tell the story of how you got there. That the problem didn't start from just now and we're trying to solve it. There are histories, there are power structures, there are people who got excluded and included. And until we recount those, we will come up with half solutions that don't really work.
Geza.
I think we have to start a movement, like new data for new ways of understanding mobility.
Oh, you're very good. You did it in 8 seconds. My God. My God. Annika, how can you beat that?
I don't know that I can, and everyone has been so eloquent. I would just say that with our new data, we have to move this to a business conversation, making the business case for equitable mobility.
Right. Anyway, I've enjoyed this. I wish I was with you, actually, rather than just floating around in a space in Berlin. So, well, there we are. Thank you very much. And we are going to continue this conversation and change the narrative. Thank you very much. See you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Charles. Bye.
Thanks.